Absolutely amazing and fantastic to have so many people here tonight. Thank you so much for coming and for crowding in. Hannah, there's obviously something about you and this book. It's just wonderful. I'm just here to welcome Hannah and Thabang to Love Books. It's absolutely lovely to have you here to launch this book, Making a Life, which is published by Wits Press. Karina van der Spoel from Wits Press is going to be the person who does the proper introduction tonight. Just one or two things that I'm going to say up front. Afterwards, Hannah is going to be signing books in the table behind me in the shop. If people who've already had a book could make a queue on this side of the table. If you still need to buy a book, it's up the stairs and your queue will be on this side of the table. There will be questions at the end. We don't have a roving mic, so if you could just stand up and shout your questions out, please. Thank you so much. Karina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And as always, thank you very much to Kate and to Love Books for hosting Wits University Press. This is sort of our, well, since Wits is in the vicinity, it's really for us always great to have launches here. Many of our authors are often here, and it's lovely to welcome you all. Thank you very much for coming. Wits Press is really very, very proud to have published this book, Making a Life, Young Men on Johannesburg's Urban Margins. Zandspruit, as many of you know or may know, is a sprawling informal settlement to the north of Johannesburg. In many ways, Zandspruit typifies many townships and settlements on the outskirts of our cities, where life is precarious and 2/3 of young people lack waged employment. Hannah Dawson's book, Making a Life, Young Men on Johannesburg's Urban Margins, explores how young men survive in informal economies, examining how they balance hustling, brokering, and other informal economic strategies with their broader social aspirations. It really offers great insights into gig economy and precarious labor situations, which we all see around us every day in Johannesburg. One of the many things that make this book special is that the book brings intimate, humanizing portraits of young men's lives, connecting readers to the personal realities behind global issues of unemployment and exclusion. And I am saying global because I think it really is not just about Zandspruit. It's also even not just about South Africa. It is truly a worldwide phenomenon. That's what I just said. Though focused on Joburg, it goes everywhere. It is written in an accessible style, and that's maybe something I want to emphasize. And not only for academics, but also for policymakers, activists, and general readers interested in the urban environments, interested in the life around you and what we see, and in social justice. This book really challenges us to rethink the relationship between work and dignity and citizenship. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our author and the speaker. Last year, on 29 May, today exactly a year ago, I met Hannah Dawson in the longest queue ever to vote in the national election. It was a 4 or 5 hour wait that day, but made pleasant and interesting by chatting with the people queuing all around you. And so I ended up next to Hannah. I didn't know her from before. It was that day in the streets of Auckland Park that she told me that she's soon finishing up a manuscript for a book that she wanted to submit for publication for Wits Press. And here we are, a year later to the day. Hannah Dawson is a senior lecturer in the Anthropology and Development Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg. And when I met her, she was still a researcher at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, where she worked at Wits. She is a born and bred Joburger. To speak with her is Thabang Sefalafala, and thank you so much, Thabang, for agreeing to speak with Hannah. He's a sociology lecturer at Wits who teaches economic sociology at Wits. He had a stint as Deputy Director for Gauteng Department of Economic Development and was a Mail and Guardian one of the Mail and Guardian top 200 young South Africans in 2019. Thabang's own research dovetails beautifully with Hannah's work as he looks at how men in their 50s, year old in Welkom in the Free State survive their precarious lives. So that makes you the perfect interlocutor with Hannah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Thabang, Hannah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in conversation tonight with my friend and colleague. We've been thinking about these questions for quite a while, so I'm happy to see this moment that we're in. So, Hannah Dawson, we're here to celebrate your book launch, Making a Life, Young Men on Johannesburg's Urban Margins. And I'm really excited about this book because it's about the everyday lives of young men in precarious contexts like Zandspruit, where they have to navigate hope, uncertainty in a city that often renders them invisible. It's about the work of life making in context of deep structural neglect and the moments of connection, creativity, and dignity that emerge even on the margins. So what struck me the most as a reader is how careful and respectful Hannah Dawson listens. Her writings doesn't reduce the young man to statistics or stereotypes. Instead, it opens up space for voices, contradictions, humor, and struggles to be seen and heard on their own terms. Tonight, we'll talk about the key insights of this book and, some of the special moments of the journey that, made up Hannah's research. So please join me in welcoming the author of Making a Life, Hannah Dawson. Okay, so this book consists of 6 chapters and an introduction. Okay, so allow me to start with the introduction. And the introduction is titled Making a Life on the Urban Periphery. And I want to ask Hannah, what does making a life mean to you and the young men whose stories you tell us about in the book?
Okay. Hi, everyone. So yeah, it's quite a thing to see so many faces, and I've never seen a room that includes the youngest members of the audience are my 2 nephews, Jonah and Fifi, hi, as well as some of my mother's friends I haven't seen in about 15 years, and then there are just a few people who I want to give a special mention to. So a few friends of mine from Zandspruit could make it tonight, and I don't know why, but to be so unto me, were sitting at the front, and now they've moved all the way to the back, as well as Nhlanhla and Malesela. And I just wanted to recognize that you're here tonight and how much it means to me. So thank you for making the trek. It's not that much of a trek, but I really appreciate it. And thank you to Thabang. So now I have to remember your question. What does making a life mean to me? And so maybe how to start answering that question. So as I think has already been alluded to, this book is kind of the product of quite a long journey. I first arrived in Zandspruit in 2011 as a wee master's student, and interested then in understanding a string of political protests that had erupted around the local election. And that was the kind of beginning of me trying to make sense of life in Zandspruit. Then really interested in the political life of the settlement and what was happening. And that was the beginning of what then became kind of 10 years of doing research in Zandspruit with a concentrated period in about 2015 and 2016. And I think that the driving question was always, as I think Karina said at the beginning, and we all know this, that South Africa is kind of seen, globally. It's the country with one of the highest, if not the highest, unemployment rates. And in a sense, not having a job is increasingly the norm if you're a young person in South Africa. It's kind of the exception if you have a job, at least a stable job. And I guess the question that I've been trying to make sense of for a long time is what that does to society, to politics. What does the economy actually mean and look like when you start taking the lives of those excluded from the waged economy seriously? And so, in a way, this book is the product of a quest which was trying to do justice to the forms of social and economic collaboration, the alternative arrangements that are required when you don't have the stability and the predictability of the privilege of a stable job. And so that was the question, and I pursued that question by looking at slightly different components of Zandspruit's social and political life. But I explored those questions always through trying to understand the everyday lives, as Thabang was saying, of young men, and a particular group of young men that I came to know, some of whom from 2011 to today, some of whom are here tonight, and who've become dear friends. And so, then trying to write this all up in a book, the making a life, I think ultimately what I was trying to do was to decenter just the focus on livelihoods or this idea of kind of economic survival, and to say we need to see the quest for livelihood in relation to what it is to build a life, or what I call life making in the book. And that making a life or building a life is never just about basic sustenance or putting money, having some money in your pocket. A life is about far more than that. It's about having a place to belong. It's about identity. It's about aspiration. It's about having a horizon through which you think your life is moving. It's about collective struggles. It's about place and home. And in a way, by talking about making a life, I'm trying to show that that is what young men are doing in a multitude of ways, is trying, despite very severe constraints. So in the context of very high levels of unemployment, with the extreme inequalities that we have in South Africa, many people, but in this book, young men in Zandspruit are forging lives, trying to build lives. And the book is trying to look at those different components of what making a life is. And in doing that, tries to say that can shed light on what the social and political life of a place like Zandspruit looks like. And so it tries to go from the individual lives of making a life to say something about a place like Zandspruit, but also other places, a bit like Zandspruit. So, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so that's very interesting. So you're looking at not just livelihoods, but how questions of identity, dignity tie into this idea of making a life, right? So it's a kind of like a holistic approach to that. But you also mentioned something very interesting, that it has to do with place, right? And I wanted to ask you then, why the choice of Zandspruit for your research? how similar or different is Zandspruit to other informal settlements?
Yeah, so I would say on the one hand, Zandspruit is a place that exemplifies or looks a lot like many other informal settlements. Most people live in totally inadequate housing. There are serious issues with infrastructure, sanitation. There's not formal electricity in many areas. And so on the one hand, Zandspruit is like many other informal settlements in terms of the living conditions in particular. But in another way, there's something about Zandspruit which is quite unique and I think different to other informal settlements, even within Johannesburg, but also other parts of the country. And that has to do with its location in the city. So I don't know if anyone here lives on the West Rand, but if you do live in the West Rand, or you know the area around, kind of from Northgate to Ramsig out towards kind of Cosmos City, Lanseria, this is an area that over the last 20 years has undergone very significant urbanization, but also a kind of, not your standard industrialization, but Kaya Sands is a kind of economic hub for light industries and business parks. Lanseria Airport has resulted in a kind of hub for freight and logistics. And so what that means is that, and there's also, right up against Zandspruit is Jackal Creek Golf Estate. So there are, within very close proximity to Zandspruit, very rich neighborhoods, shopping malls, and like I said, these kind of areas where there is a concentration of waged work. And so because of that proximity to this kind of urban economic node, compared to other informal settlements, I think, in other parts of the country, there is more economic opportunities in the formal economy available nearby. And I think that does make Zandspruit slightly different to some other informal settlements, because those resources that people, the wages that people earn in those nearby areas trickle into Zandspruit, which means, for example, the housing and the rental market is very vibrant. Most people that have a job nearby are renting a home or a shack or a small room inside Zandspruit. Excuse me. And those resources that are moving through Zandspruit, in a sense, depend upon the wages that are earned in the surrounding areas. So for me, that on the one hand, it kind of exemplifies informal settlements in other places, but on the other hand, I think its local economy is unique because of its proximity to other economic opportunities.
Yes, and also, in one of your chapters, you mentioned that people that are living in Zandspruit have a 1.5 times higher, chance of finding employment than people living elsewhere in the country. And that is due to what you alluded to, its positionality, near middle-class settlements, upper middle-class settlements, but also, important developmental nodes, like the airport and so on. But it's still a township. And here's the thing about townships and how we think about townships. Often when we think about townships, we don't think about these opportunities. We often imagine townships and even experience townships in terms of lack, not opportunities, right? So you kind of putting a different perspective on that. So when we think of townships, most of the time we think of lack of housing, lack of jobs, lack of infrastructure. But your book shows something more complex. Can you talk about the forms of life making and DIY development, what you call DIY development you witnessed, and how important are social connections?
That's a whole chapter of the book. Okay. Maybe I'll just give you a summary of the chapter. So I guess before DIY development, the kind of... so in one chapter, I really try to zoom into what are some of these alternative modes of making money that are not waged employment. Because even though there's, relative to other places, economic opportunities, there are still many people without waged employment. And in the book, I kind of talk about two kind of modes of making money in the local economy. And the one I call hustling, and the other one I call brokering. And hustling kind of is trying to capture a multitude of ways in which people make money in the settlement that often we would refer to as the informal economy. So this is everything from renting shacks to running, like working as a mashonisa, a informal lender, to those that operate the informal electricity wires, and people pay a monthly fee to access that electricity, to those involved in the gambling trade, the drug dealing trade, but also those just selling a variety of goods. So it's really a huge array of economic activities. And so I cluster that around hustling. And these are a variety of strategies done to try and capture resources of those who live in Zandspruit. And brokering is a little bit different, as I describe it in the book, which is trying to just make visible, and especially young people in the community are very involved in an important array of community, a variety of kinds of community work that involves everything from sports forums to community organizations. Some become registered NGOs, many of them don't. And these not only do important things within the community, but they also become a way to access resources, either from government entities and departments, sometimes from larger NGOs that want to operate in a place like Zandspruit. And so by creating community structures, community organizations, this provides a way to not only do good in the community, but to harness some of those resources. And both hustling and brokering, critical to those are social connections. You need social connections to access those resources. But what's interesting about brokering and hustling is they also require a different kind of local knowledge. A lot of the hustling strategies require you to be very good at navigating the informal kind of governance structures and the street committees, and whereas the brokering, as I describe it, is much more embedded in kind of formal politics, party politics. You've got to know people in the kind of government machinery. So both depend on social networks and a kind of political fluency, but they're slightly different, even though some people I write about in the book move between these two worlds. So they're not necessarily like a harsh choice. But in both social connections, having networks is critical to being able to access money if you don't have a job. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so you describe a rather counterintuitive attitude towards jobs. In the book, she talks about how young men often reject low-wage work. And so I want to ask you, how do we make sense of people rejecting low-wage work amidst high unemployment?
Yeah. It's another chapter in the book. So this was something that I think very early on in my research was something I didn't have a full grasp on, and it took me a little while. And there's many ways to answer that question. On the one hand, those who can turn down the very worst, lowest paying jobs available in the community, which often are day jobs that you get from standing on the side of the road in things like construction and rubbish removal. there's a kind of hierarchy of jobs. Those are seen as the absolute worst jobs available. But a job in a retail store or doing private security is not necessarily, is viewed as superior to that, at least amongst my interlocutors, but not necessarily always desirable, especially if you've done those jobs a number of times. So on the one hand, you could say, well, on the one hand, if you have access to another means of accessing money, especially that, is somewhat lucrative, well, that's part of the refusal of work. But I spent quite a big chunk of the research in Zandspruit was really trying to understand this refusal of low-wage jobs. And I did very detailed, what I called work histories with young men. And when I say young, many of them were late 20s, early 30s, at the time my age. We were friends, peers in many senses. Not all of my interlocutors are exactly my age, but when I was doing the interviews. And so I was very interested in understanding what someone's first job was, then what they did when that job came to an end, then the next job, and became struck when I was doing these work history interviews with over 30 men that in a surprising number of cases, a job had come to an end because someone had just decided to not go back one day. Or there'd been some incident or something where that person just no longer wanted to take that job. And so I began to really want to try and understand what's happening there. When, as Thabang was saying, we have such high levels of unemployment, how do we make sense then of someone opting out? I'm very specifically here of low-wage jobs. We're not talking about perhaps a more stable, different type of job might lead to a different response. And in the book, I kind of outlined the three most common reasons that kept emerging from these interviews around why someone left a job, and the details in the book. But the first one really related to the working conditions and the idea that one could stay in a job for a long period of time, but it never allowed one to improve one's life situation. The second main reason related to really racial inequality and antagonisms. And I think the thing to emphasize here is often we think about a job leading to a feeling of inclusion in society, but I came to realize very quickly that if you're selling hot food in a Pick and Pay, that job every day is a very visceral reminder of where you are on the social ladder. And so that job is experienced as a reminder of your social exclusion, in a sense. And that is racialized. Those inequalities are still very racialized in South Africa's society. And the third one is a more complex one, which is around, the social demands of having a wage, which, we call black tax, just kind of a shorthand in South Africa, but that to have a job also comes with a lot of responsibility and obligation. That is its own stress and pressure, which is a part of this complex landscape. And so I think for me, the refusal of low-wage jobs was really just coming to understand that to refuse a job is not just to say you don't want something. It's not only a protest against something, but it's ultimately saying it's a claim to something more. It's saying I should deserve something better, or the post-apartheid economy should be distributed differently. And so in the book I talk about a refusal of a kind of job that only allows you to survive and never allows you to live. So I hope that answers it.
No, absolutely. And I'm hoping that my next question is not a chapter, right? So I will try. So what I heard you describing is that young people's attitudes towards jobs are shaped by their ideas of dignity, their ideas of aspiration, their ideas of citizenship, right? And that you made a very interesting point that refusal is not just about protest or resisting low-wage work, but it's about a claim for something better. right? And perhaps there's a word that we can use to capture this thing of wanting something better. And maybe the word aspiration does it, right? In chapter 5, you write about aspiration, about among the young men in Zandspruit. Please share with us, what were your findings about aspiration in this context?
Okay, chapter 5. So maybe I'll just try to be quite brief on this one. And the title is something like affording, the aspiration to afford momentary consumption when the future's out of reach. But really, when I would ask people and friends in Zandspruit about their future aspirations, which, some of these are like evolving conversations over time, a word that always cropped up, well, the one was something I've already referred to, was this idea of wanting to live or enjoy, not just survive. So, and I think that's quite self-explanatory. But if the present for most people in Zandspruit is kind of everyday hustling, surviving, you never really get to escape the kind of immediate present. So the desire to live is partly about having a horizon in which you can really begin to craft a life that you have some semblance of control over. But this idea of living or enjoying was another word that often emerged again and again, occurred alongside another word, which is this idea of wanting to afford. And so I unpack what I came to understand that might mean. And in short, to be able to afford is to be able to have resources at a scale that one currently doesn't often have. But to be able to afford is also to be able to participate in modes of consumption that are closely aligned with status, upward mobility. But to be able to afford is also about being able to care for others in your family. To be able to afford to buy your mother a home, or being able to send your children to a better school. And so I unpack this kind of aspiration to afford really for a different kind of life that is really about more economic stability. I don't know, maybe I'll leave it there.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, and so in a community like Zandspruit, you speak about the distinction between insiders and outsiders. And you make the point that it's important to understand insiders and outsiders, for the refusal of work, but also but also the political economy of the settlement, right? Can you tell us how you came to understand these distinctions of insider and outsider and why they matter?
Yeah, so I think I talk about this in the book, but the first time I heard this idea of insiders and outsiders was actually back in 2011. In the first few weeks, I was in Zandspruit and I was spending half a day with this local political activist who said to me on one of our walks, he said, the people that come from outside, they don't care about development here in Zandspruit. It's only us, like those who've lived here a long time, who care about development. And so that was the first time I heard this kind of distinction being made between people who've been living in Zandspruit since its very early beginnings in the years around the democratic transition, the mid-90s, some of whom actually lived on the plots nearby, going back to the 80s or earlier. But also those who moved to Zandspruit in the early 2000s, which was still, where another section of the settlement only really began to develop in those early years. And then this idea of outsiders that was referring to people that have moved to the settlement more recently, that included both someone, say, from Limpopo province who's come to Joburg for work and they've heard Zandspruit, they have a connection in Zandspruit, or they've heard that there's jobs nearby, which there is. But an outsider also, before I came to understand these concepts more, is also referring to migrants coming from Mozambique, from Zimbabwe, and elsewhere beyond South Africa's borders. And so that was the first time I kind of really started to make sense of this distinction as it related to politics and the protests and who was participating and who wasn't, and the resentment that led to. But I came to learn really over time, this was something that took me a long time to kind of make sense of, is how important these distinctions actually were for understanding the whole, I think, as Thabang put it, the kind of political economy of the settlement. And I think why they matter is the most obvious way to maybe make the point is to say that most established residents who've lived in Zandspruit a long time are much more likely to own property, own land, not rent, but often be more likely to earn rental income because they have access to a stand, sometimes more than one stand. Whereas someone who's come from Zimbabwe or someone that's only recently moved from, say, Limpopo province is nearly always going to be a tenant. And so the insider-outsider kind of division, even though there's layers to those divisions, is very critical to understanding how the housing and the property market works. But that housing and property market is also really important for understanding who does what kind of jobs and who doesn't. So if you don't pay rent, you have just lower costs of urban living, but you also often have access to rental income. And so that already shapes the calculation of if a job that's going to pay you 200 Rand for the day is worth it or not. And so in the book, I tried to show that actually we can't really understand how the labor market works or how the local economy works in terms of how money moves and who gets to lay claim to bigger chunks of money in various sections of the settlement if we don't actually understand how it relates to the property market. And so the insider-outsider division actually has become quite central to the book and my understanding of the local economy, but it's something I gradually came to see as being quite significant.
Awesome. As we transition to Q&A, I just want to ask you a quick question about it's a small place. What are the larger issues that it's highlighting? How does this book about young people in Johannesburg in a specific informal settlement speak to broader debates about youth unemployment, development, informal settlements?
Yeah, I think it's my hope that it will, and it does. I think part of the book is trying to make visible forms of economic life that I think often are not taken seriously or are made invisible. I think the book is also trying to say something about how the local economy actually works by not asking who does what, but watching how money moves and building an understanding of what we now in the policy space call the township economy. And I hope that some of these insights, I think they will speak into a range of public and policy conversations. And on informal settlements, I really just think trying to take parts of their economic and political life seriously, to understand also how people are collectively forging modes of life there in the failure of the state to develop, in particular, Zandspruit. That's a whole story I haven't been able to go into. People are organizing. I didn't really get to answer that question earlier about DIY development. So there's individual life-making strategies, but there's also collective forms of life and infrastructure being built. And I hope that this book helps us take those seriously. And exactly, how it speaks to these debates, I think, is, yet to be seen. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it now to Q&A. So we don't have a roving mic, unfortunately. So I'm going to ask those that are at the back that have got questions just to please project your voice so that we can hear you. Okay. Okay. So let's take 4 questions in this round. Yeah, 4 questions per round. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 2 at the back. Okay. 2 at the back. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah. You lucky. My name is Gift. I'm also trying to work in the space of youth in another West Rand township, Kagiso. But I want to steal your brains really on in the place that you work in, trying to confront the question, or did the question confront you? What should be done and who should be doing that to make the lives of these young people and their aspirations be fulfilled or better, that kind of thing. How can we, that kind of thing be realized? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So it's a question of who? Yes, Dale.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Congrats on the book. Listen, this issue of the property relations and going down, in many ways, what that's...
Everybody can hear the question. You can actually stretch it.
Sure. The issue of the property relations and the inside-outside and the way that constructs social life, political life, economic life, in many ways, isn't the counterintuitive notion of that is that capitalist development has come down right into the informal settlement. In some ways, we see it as an exclusive thing, that it's excluded from the economy, and yet what you're essentially saying is that it's absolutely central in many, many ways. It's just at a particular level. And what that does is not only in terms of the macro political economy, but also in terms of the micro in the context of that community, it reproduces those very same relationships in just at a different level that you see in every part of society. So I think that's a very, if you're thinking about the larger political economy, both within that, the micro and macro, that's a very, very important element of understanding, because sometimes mainstream economics basically completely dismisses the relevancy of a place like Zandspruit in the capitalist accumulation and the economy and the profit making, because it seems to be so outside of things, and yet it's actually right inside. Yeah.
Thank you.
The 2 questioners in the back, do you mind coming to speak in the mic, then everybody hear the...
Good evening, everybody. Hi there, Hannah. First, congratulations on the book. Look forward to reading it. I haven't gotten around to it. 2 questions from my side. The first question is on urban densification, and the second question is around sort of like the spatial segregation based on income, sort of like the consensus that the country's been built on since for the longest time. So having sort of gone to Zandspruit and done your study there, I suppose a close place there is Cosmos City, which is sort of a post-democratic project, which was built with this idea of having residential areas for low-income earners. But one of the themes that are coming through now, you're talking about this bustling rental, back room rental market that's happening there, but the infrastructure has sort of been built for residential low-density living. To what extent do you think that as a country we need to shift towards a medium density to high density sort of type of thinking in terms of the low income earning group in order to be able to support that? The second question is around sort of like the spatial segregation of the country based on income. So I think since around 1948, that's when sort of like this was sort of institutionalized on a racial basis. And in 1994, it was deracialized, but we still maintain sort of like a spatial segregation based on income. So if you look at places like now, I've seen this sort of like informal settlements sprouting up in sort of like the northern suburbs, as you will. I've seen one in Paul's Wharf on corner, I think, Witkoppen in Maine. There's another one there by Peter Place, I think in Bryanston. And then there's a few also in Pretoria. So to what extent do you see sort of like the breakdown of this consensus as sort of challenging this notion of like the spatial segregation of people based on income? And what measures do you think that government could inject into to sort of like support the low wages that you were talking about as being drivers of sort of like people wanting to live closer in order to minimize those costs to make some of the jobs more viable in the country?
Was there another person there? Then I think
Behind you.
we'll do the next round.
Oh, is there? Okay. Okay.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you. I just want to, it's a question for you, really. And you're speaking about insider-outsider sort of perspectives. And I wonder where you as a researcher then fit into that and how you navigate your internal sort of like insider-outsider relationship. Because I think there is something about the different positionalities that you play both as researcher, but also as, I suppose, one of, right? And so what is that for you and how did it kind of play out between the moment of the, I suppose, the inception of the thought of doing this thing and then being in a room like this with the invited guests that you have?
Excellent. All right. Thanks. Over to you, Hannah.
Okay, thanks. Those were some good questions. Thabang, if you want to chip in at any point, you're welcome. You're so welcome. Okay, I'll try to take them as I heard them. Actually, I think yours is the hardest. No, I think it is the hardest. You can say the things we all already know, the things we hear on the radio, but of course, there's many things, and we could have a longer conversation. But the one thing I would just say is there are so many, some of them are in this room, people doing a whole range of important work in local communities, and especially local community organizations often run by young people. Sometimes these are internet cafes, sometimes these are community organizations that are doing a whole host of things. And it would be so easy to link resources directly to people that know these communities in ways I could never understand them, and do something. It's just about scaling stuff that's already happening. And so I think, there's a lot of talk about all this money that goes towards training people to be entrepreneurs, and it's like, if you just spent a little bit of time about understanding what is already working, who's doing good work, and you actually just directed money in those directions, I think a lot could come from that. Dale, I have lots to say on this question around property. In the book, I talk about it in relation to this idea of kind of commodification from below. And but I think the fact that some of this process has kind of taken root in the property market. At the beginning of Zandspruit's history, land was being occupied. There was actually some commodification from below early in the 2000s. A certain someone I talk about in the book, it's not his real name, was selling off stands. But I do think this kind of process of the commercialization of the property and rental market, which is something I want to be studying more about, I've only got more interested in it, I think has accentuated over time. And I think it partly reflects the failure of the post-apartheid state the post-apartheid economy to include the majority in meaningful ways. And so that leads to something like land and property that might have been occupied in certain moments collectively, then being used by some as a form of accumulating wealth. So I think when you take that bigger picture, you have to come back to the very obvious point that the post-apartheid economy is still in the hands of very few. And I think the commercialization of the property market to some extent has to be seen in that light. Then to the question about, so Zandspruit, you spoke about urban densification and Cosmo cities. I actually lived in Cosmo City for a year, which is the neighboring community. It's very interesting because it was kind of the first post-apartheid township to be built. And what's interesting about Cosmo City, it kind of was a post-apartheid kind of experiment of a sort of combining, it's a mixed income residential development. So it includes, I forget now the number offhand, I think it's 3,000 RDP shacks. It included like affordable rental accommodation, apartments, so it's not just single story, and then kind of bonded housing. Well, not quite townhouses, but, and so it sounds like you know Cosmo very well, and even compared to the year I lived in Cosmo to now, sometimes I just drive through and, I mean, it has densified in ways that I couldn't have even comprehended, and I think the kind of densification that's happened in Cosmo has been paralleled in Zandspruit in a certain way. For example, in 2011, I could think of maybe 1 or 2 double-story shacks in Zandspruit, whereas now people are building 8 rooms, single floor, 8 rooms, second floor. And people are also increasingly building concrete. So that's another shift that I, despite there still not being formal property rights, people increasingly are investing more serious money in building brick and mortar buildings, either for themselves or because you can get a higher rent on a concrete room. So I think that densification is happening across the board. And your question was, is that part of the solution? Do we need to move to medium to high density? I mean, I think yes, for the sustainability. When I think about the city, this is not my area of expertise. There's a lot of urban policy housing people in this room who know a lot better. But I do think densification is part of the solution in that sense. But it's also what is happening in a place like Zandspruit. And yes, it comes with all the very difficult challenges of infrastructure. I mean, Zandspruit doesn't even have the bulk infrastructure in most areas for it. So how you resolve that is a conundrum. And I don't want to pretend I really know how to get out of that. But I do think densification has to be, an affordable rental has to be part of the solution from what I understand from my time in Zandspruit, yeah. Oh, and there was another one. Oh, yes, that very critical question. Thank you. I really like how you phrased it. And I mean, I've always been an outsider in Zandspruit, and yet there's an irony, which I think that tonight here I am up front talking about Zandspruit as if I'm a resident of it. But in a sense, I do feel like I understand something about Zandspruit. I couldn't have written a whole book if I didn't feel my time there had led to real insight and to be so. And in Hlanhla at the back will know that I'm constantly in conversation. Have I got this? Have I understood that? I think they're quite happy the book now exists. But I see that in a way I'm, maybe speaking as if I have, as an insider with some knowledge of how Zandspruit functions. But as it relates to the question of fieldwork, I was an outsider in many ways. I mean, I'm not a resident of Zandspruit. I'm a white woman, and I'm privileged in a whole range of ways. And something I reflect on in the book is of course what that meant. And I speak about, on the one hand, how it meant there was always a distance. But on the other hand, there was a kind of a curiosity. Who is this woman? And why is she walking on the streets alone? And what's wrong with her? And that over time, I think, did lead to openness and curiosity. But also, there was suspicion and mistrust and things that had to be negotiated over time and continue to be. But I wanted to make one other point on that, but it skips my mind. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, do we have time for another round? Yes, let's do it. Let's go. Okay, so...
Sorry, again. My name is Dave Southwood. So the word place popped up and then it evaporated. And when you were talking about the inhabitants of Zandspruit hustling and needing to know what the lie of the land was, I thought that maybe that would give someone a sense of place because it's familiarity. Is the sense of place which you detected in the people that you interviewed connected to the activity connected to economic imperatives? Or do you think that there are activities during, in inverted commas, the leisure time of the day, or when people have their own, they can make decisions about what they do? So how is the sense of place? What sort of activities make for a sense of place? And I mean, maybe it's a young population, maybe sense of place will become more ingrained as time passes, but yeah.
I don't think I'm going to reach. Are you coming around? Try to keep it.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Dr. Hannah. You will pardon me. You know how I like to contextualize things. She taught me, by the way. All right, so my question goes, when thinking about recommendations on some ways in which the precarity under which residents in townships such as Zandspruit live, do you think a mitigation of some of these socioeconomic hardships people in townships face ought to be derived from external interventions such as government programs, or should emerge from internal interventions in the form of initiatives by the locals? Now, if internal, or even if external, depending on which side you choose, in what way should these interventions be?
And then we had two questions here. Do you mind coming to the mic? Oh, thank you so much, Liz.
Hello, Hannah. Thank you. My name is Liz Gunner. I wanted to ask a question about languages and what language you use, because depending on what language you use, you get certain answers you might not get in another language. And I guess it's a very multilingual society. So I'd love to hear about that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My question is, since we are living in the information world society, so initially we are living in the industrial revolution, whereby we are being asked to go to school, come back and find employment. So my question is, since we are living in the information world, whereby we have alternative or ways of making incomes. So how do we ensure that we bring together relevant stakeholders to ensure that they teach young people how to make money?
Making money. Okay. Hannah, over to you.
Okay, great. Thabang, you want to take any of those ones? Okay. What about the last one? Okay. Yes, so Dave, on place and sense of place. I mean, I'd love you to read the book, and because in a way, place, also, you know, the whole idea of sense of place and placemaking, this was never central to a lot of my research, but in writing the book, which became quite a different project to things I'd written before, I wanted to tell a story that wasn't just about individual young men's lives, but about this place. And so it became this kind of entanglement between the making of individual lives and the making and unmaking and remaking of Zandspruit's political and social life. So there's like lots of ways in which place and sense of place shows up. And partly because a lot of these hustling strategies are tied to place. You actually, it's not just about having a piece of land or a plot where you can operate your mechanic business or your car wash, or it's also about having this is about the politics of belonging, which is in the book. It's about being able to have the social position, which is often about how long you've lived there, who you know, do you have the street credibility to lay claim to territory, like being able to say, I'm going to operate here. And so this kind of sense of place, the politics of belonging, is deeply part of the economic lay of the land, I think. But of course, you're speaking, and that's in the chapter on aspiration, I talk about that no one wants to live in Zandspruit. No one aspires to stay in Zandspruit. Everyone's aspiration is to leave Zandspruit. And yet, people are making investments in Zandspruit to make the best kind of life, that they can. And for example, if you have property, that gives you a kind of one-up. So yes, and I think there is a whole conversation about, but at the same time, people live lives, they fall in love, they raise their children in Zandspruit, they have their favorite tavern, they have, etc. So in a sense, I like that you brought up this question of leisure. You know, Zandspruit is also a place where people socialize. There's the soccer ground, there's different, you know, I've never really focused on that, but I just know there's different soccer terrains, and Ntlantla, who's here, could tell you how that works. Lesebe, you can tell he's an A+ student. I think he gave me an exam question, and he enjoyed that one. Felt like an exam question. But his question around, you know, does it lie with kind of government programs or internal interventions? I think it really exists at the intersection of those. It's partly my answer to Gift. There are lots of resources in the state, and you see how around elections, especially, all of a sudden there is money made available in Zandspruit. But if you were to take that money and think differently and think with some very committed local community members, one or two are in the room here tonight, I think things could happen. So I think it is about that intersection rather than either or. Liz, that's a really great question. Thank you for that. And I reflect a little bit on it. So in the book, Zandspruit is an incredibly multilingual place. At least the 2011 census data showed that not one of South Africa's official languages spoken by more than 20% of the population of Zandspruit, which shows just how diverse it is. So that's another... Zandspruit is very diverse in that sense, which is also quite distinct from some other settlements in the, at least, and that's partly explained by being a post-apartheid settlement. Really, people really have come from many of South Africa's provinces, and many, over 20% of the population, and those are the 2011 census statistics, come from some of the other countries I mentioned earlier. And so, you know, I had to consider the question of language early on in the into the research. Of course, I'm very much an English, white-speaking woman who's really predominantly only fluent in English. But did I seriously invest in improving my very bad Zulu or another language? And given that linguistic fluidity, but also that I never would have really got very good at Zulu, if I'm honest. So I did most of the work in English. And I guess the thing I appreciated about, or came to appreciate about doing the interviews in English, although there's lots lost, and I agree with you 100% that just like I think if this research had been done by someone else, again, that it shapes the research questions, it shapes the conversations, but I do think by doing the conversations in English and not having a translator at any point in the conversation allowed for a depth of relationship to develop over time. And most of my interlocutors were very fluent in English, had schooled in English, and so English, in a sense, wasn't a barrier to engaging in a very extended conversation over weeks and months. But of course, I absolutely realize that if conversations had been had in people's home languages, I think that would have opened up whole new lines of meaning and interpretation. But that wasn't, I think, the study I could do in the years I especially had elongated periods of time in Zandspruit. But yeah. And yes, the final question, who's also a student in my department at UJ, but I haven't had the pleasure of teaching him, but we recently spoke in the common room. And I think Thabang said he was going to answer that question.
Okay, I will try. So he asked a question about the information age, right? And I think there's a particular way in which the book deals with that, right? So the first point that the book makes is that there's money circulating in the township. So there's no problem of money circulating, right? So that's one. So how people get to the money is through local information. So I think how you phrase this is about information age and so on. But how people really get to the money is through the social connections and how information, moves between people. You sitting at a tavern, enjoying, right? And you can even eavesdrop and hear about an opportunity that you didn't know, right? So she's got a chapter called Who You Know Matters, right? And in that, it describes how money moves between people that are connected to opportunities, hustling, brokers, right? But here's the catch about Hannah's book. It's not just about money. It's about making a life, which involves, and she doesn't romanticize this, she's very careful in making us understand that these are struggles and in, hardships, right? But she's very clear that this is not just about money. It's about dignity. It's about identity. It is about hope. It's about aspiration. It's about all of these things that make a life, right, beyond money. And of course, money is an important part of it, but what she's saying is that it's not just the money, right? It's all of these other social dimensions that make a life, true to the title, making a life, right? And yes, so it gives a different understanding of the township, not as a place of surplus populations, of poverty, but also a place where things happen and people make things happen, right? So she captures very eloquently the ways in which people activate economic opportunities in the context of scarcity, in the context of poverty, in the context of misgovernance, and how people make it work for themselves, right? And I think the book will do a great job in helping us understand, all of these issues that we've unpacked. Okay, so with that, I would like to thank you for attending and for your being a captive audience, beautiful questions. But this wouldn't have happened if Hannah didn't write the book. So, Hannah, thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.